Hi, guys. Welcome back to the Touch MBA podcast. I am your host, Darren. It's not too often that you get a former head of MBA admissions and financial aid for the Wharton Business School on the show, but that's what I have for you guys today. Thomas Caleel is the host of the Admittedly podcast. He's the CEO of Global Education Opportunities, an international education consulting and admissions advisory firm. Thomas was as I mentioned, head of MBA admissions at Wharton for 4 years, from 2005 to 2008. And in this episode, what I really tried to do is get into Thomas's brain and see how he views the whole MBA admissions process, what holistic means to him, what are the key criteria that you need to know as applicants to really stand out, when you're applying to such a competitive program like Wharton. We also talk about Thomas's 5 questions that he believes you really need to drill down and think deeply about so that you can present a compelling case to business schools and present that case in a very authentic voice that makes you stand out from your peers. I also asked Thomas about his views on return on investment with MBAs, who should and shouldn't get an MBA. I mean, Thomas was an entrepreneur before he got his MBA at Wharton, so I wanted to ask him about that as well. And I think in general, by the end of this episode, you'll just have a much better idea of how a gatekeeper at a top business school like Wharton thinks about his or her role as an admissions director and how that person thinks about building a class and what that person is looking for. So you'll also walk away with some really concrete tools that you can use to immediately strengthen your application. Before we jump into the episode with Thomas, if you need help shortlisting best fit business schools, do come visit us at touchmba.com. We offer free school selection help, meaning we evaluate your competitiveness at your target MBA programs. We recommend best fit business schools given your interests and your profile. And we also give you the opportunity to share your profile with top ranked business schools around the world for early assessments. So this is how we're trying to help you guys shortlist schools that could be great investments for yourself and for your careers. All right, so you can find all of that at touchmba.com. Now, let's get straight to my conversation with Thomas Caleel. Here we go. And I'm super excited about this week's guest. He is the host of the Admittedly podcast and chairman and founder of Global Education Opportunities, an international education consulting and admissions advisory firm. He served as the head of MBA admissions and financial aid for the Wharton Business School from 2005 to 2008, where he observed how exceptional candidates were able to successfully differentiate themselves through their applications. He also graduated from the University of Pennsylvania twice, not just from Wharton, but also with a bachelor's in international relations, which was my undergrad major as well. And then with an MBA, as I mentioned, from Wharton in 2003. Thomas Caleel, welcome to the Touch MBA podcast. It's great to have you here.
It's really nice to be here, Darren. Thank you. Thank you very much. And a very nice, warm welcome from a Princeton Tiger. Usually You guys are never that gracious to,
come on,
especially a lifelong Quaker like myself.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. You guys were definitely our biggest rivals, especially when I was back in school, especially in basketball on the basketball court. We had some great games that I'll forever remember.
That we did.
Yes, absolutely. So, Thomas, let's just jump straight into it. I mean, first, mind sharing a little bit about the work you do at Global Education Opportunities?
Sure, I'd be happy to. We do several things. We work with students and families from around the world on admissions issues. Looking at prep schools, undergraduate and graduate, including MBA. I do a lot of pro bono work. I work with foundations and a couple schools serving underrepresented groups to help kind of inculcate a culture of admissions and higher education and helping students and families understand what that path is. And then I do advisory work with governments, large corporations and foundations, doing different things, sometimes helping build out things that a lot of American students take for granted, which are college guidance counselors in schools and a culture within the school, educating teachers on how to write effective recommendations, talking with counselors about how to write effective school profiles and student profiles, and then other education related advisory work in around the world.
Yes. And are you still in touch with a lot of your alumni from Wharton?
Very much in touch. I just had lunch today with a cohort mate of mine and one of my very dear friends. He's godfather to one of my children.
Oh, wow.
And I just came back from my 20th MBA reunion. As you said, I got my MBA a long, long time ago. It was very hard.
I said this off the podcast before we started.
we had to write out our finance formulas in charcoal on the cave walls. But yes, no, it's amazing to see.
Yeah.
One of the wonderful things about an MBA, and I'm sure you see this from the many generations of students that you worked with and admitted while you were at Singapore Management University, is they go on to do such amazing and diverse things, right? And they go on, and some of them are truly changing the world in all these different industries around the globe. And especially then when you come back together to reconnect is wonderful. But truthfully, I've been in touch with many, many alumni over my career, both socially and professionally.
That's great to hear. So my first question for you, Thomas, is you were in the seat. You were running admissions for one of the world's top business schools, one of the world's most renowned business schools. And I know it was, over a decade ago, but still, I'm sure, through your work, you have very strong opinions about this. So applicants are really, I would say they're tired of hearing the word holistic, because it is a very important word. And it is the truth, I believe, of what admissions directors do. But what I'm curious to know is, in your mind, what is your framework in your mind, and how do you break down what holistic means? I have my own sort of breakdown, and I've tried to help, everyone who comes to Touch MBA know, look, this is not a formula. There's no formulaic way you can get into these top schools, but these are kind of some things you should definitely think about that I believe can help you guys really improve your chances. So I'd love to jump inside your head and all your experience and kind of see how you view the admissions process, right? Like what is that holistic approach in your head? What does that mean?
Well, I think, you raise a really good point, and it's always a pleasure to talk to somebody who was also in the chair, right? Because I think as an admissions director or dean, or whatever the title is at different schools, I think it's very important, because you're not just looking at slices of the class, right? Or a particular. I had organized my office. I had associate directors and senior associate directors who were responsible for different pools, right? So they would have responsibility for the the non-traditional pool, or underrepresented minorities, or different regional groups. So they would be expert in that particular demographic. But then I would bring everybody together, because you're looking at, the word holistically applies to the class, it applies to the student, right? And those things, I think one of the things people get so frustrated with people like you and I is that, they're like, as you said, there's no formula, and the target, at least when I was at Wharton, changed every year. Right, because on the off season, I would spend a lot of time speaking to stakeholders, faculty, administration, the dean, students, and understanding, okay, where is the school going? What are we looking for? What's the impact we want to make 20, 30, 40 years from now? And who are the students that we need to execute that? And furthermore, are there priorities within the university? And recently, Wharton announced that it had achieved the first 50-50 gender balanced class, right? And so a lot of imperatives around diversity, and diversity on every single metric, right? So you can pick one metric of diversity, but those things are long-term goals where you're trying to figure that out. And every year you're looking at, okay, what would we ideally like the class to look like in rough terms? But then, as you know, too, we have no control as admissions professionals over who's applying, right? We can shape that, we can encourage it, we can guide that. So one of the things we have to do as well is look at what our pool of applicants is and then say, okay, now we need to look and we need to see, okay, what I would look for are things like intellectual curiosity. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room, but I want you to be relentlessly curious, right? How have you created opportunities for yourself? And very importantly, how have you created opportunities for yourself relative to your advantage, background, privilege, whatever you want to call it, right? And how have you overachieved in areas of your life, right? Because when you are applying to highly selective schools, I think it's important that students realize this is not a best athlete race, right? And the way that I always say is back when I was applying to college, I would say it really, there was this formula. You needed to do some sports, you needed to do some volunteer work, you needed to get good grades. And what I think universities found is that they were building classes in relatively horizontal layers, right? Because people would end up being somewhat similar, right? And that shifted, they've kind of taken that horizontal layer and inverted it to a vertical layer. And for your consultants out there, right, what's your spike? And so I think what universities are focusing on a lot now in the MBA world and in the undergraduate world is finding people who are really, really good at what they do, right? So you are super passionate about chemistry. You are super passionate about the violin. You're super passionate about the arts. You're super passionate about finance. And then by bringing all those people together who are smart, curious, driven people, you create this opportunity for people who are really good at what they do to interact and hopefully expand people's minds. And so when you talk about diversity in an MBA class, right, you want in your cohort, you want in your classes, people who are different than you, right? So in my cohort, I was one of the few entrepreneurs, right? And I was always asking and learning from the people who came from industry or consulting or banking or tech or whatever it was, because everybody brings that their unique perspective and they want to push it in, right? And so I think that, and feel free to cut me off because I have a tendency to give very long answers to short questions.
No, this is great.
And so I think from the admissions side, as you're looking at the file, the term holistic just means we're trying to get the biggest and best sense of you, right? And one of the statistics I gave was that we would get around 8,000 applications every year. And we were looking for a class of 800. And if you looked at GMAT scores above 750, right, about half of our applicant pool had GMAT scores higher than 750.
Oof, wow.
So if this was a best athlete where we were saying, okay, we just want the highest GPA from the best schools and the best GMAT, that would make an insanely boring class. Can you imagine being in a class like this? Everybody would be relatively homogenous and relatively the same, right? But we're going to judge you differently. So if you went to a good engineering undergrad school and you did well, got a good GMAT score, you went and worked, let's say, on Wall Street in finance, right? Your mother was a doctor, your father was a professor. We're going to hold you to a very high standard, right? Because you have all the advantages there. And we're going to say, okay, we're going to expect that you get a very good GMAT score because you know how to do this, right? But if I'm looking at, and this is just me talking, if I'm looking at a non-traditional student coming from the performing arts or coming from the nonprofit sector, we're going to look for things like drive, innovation, differently, because it wouldn't be fair to hold them to the same standard of, let's say, quantitative rigor as an engineer. That's just not fair. So holistic means we're looking at everything that you do, right? And it helps also separate out when you're looking at, I would say, similar candidates, right? So the refrain, and I'm sure you've heard this, the refrain, just to take an example that you hear from all the consultants and investment bankers is, hey, I don't have a lot of extracurricular activities because I'm super busy. Okay. Is that a valid point? Yes. Is it true that they're very busy? Yes. But I think we both can give examples when you look at the applicant pool of bankers and consultants who wrote books, devoted a lot of time to nonprofit work, did interesting things with the limited time that they had, and created, either took advantage or created advantage where there might not be some. And so that's where you get this holistic, this 360-degree view of somebody. And you're like, okay, this is a person who truly goes beyond. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for that person who you're very excited to meet. And you know that, right? You read, when you've read those applications, you're like, wow, this person jumps off the page and is really interesting. So, but also not falling into the trap when I use the term interesting, because then the next question is, well, what if I haven't done something crazy interesting? I didn't, summit Everest with no oxygen to raise $1 million for orphans. You're like, okay, that's a different kind of interesting, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Thank you for that. I think there's so much there within that answer that we could go deeper on. But as you were talking, I was thinking, wow, 8,000 applications to 800 eventually enrolled students. Would you mind taking us kind of behind the scenes in terms of how does that process even work to start narrowing down the number of files you're looking at to approach to interview? Are there discussions amongst your team in terms of like, oh, this applicant, we should interview this applicant over this applicant? Like, how does that even work to siphon down such a huge number of applications to a relatively more doable number of applicants you can approach for interviews or to get to know better?
Of course. And, the funny thing is that I would do these information sessions, and I believe in radical transparency, right? So, I would stand in front of a room full of people and I would have a PowerPoint presentation and I would say, okay, this is exactly how we review a file. And I would lead some of them through mock
Love it.
file revisions, all the things that you've done as well. And my favorite part of that was somebody raise their hand and say, yeah, no, that's not true. And you kind of scratch your head, right? And you look at me and say, well, that's kind of funny because I literally run the office and I built these policies in conjunction with my team. Some team members have been doing this for 25 years. I promise you, this is the way we're doing it. And they're like, nope, I read on, this forum or that forum, or my friend told me that that's not how it happens. So you're like, okay, I'm not sure what to say. But I think it's, so at Wharton in particular, we had a unique system where we would hire about 60 second-year students every year. It was a highly competitive process. We would hire them, train them, and they did all the first reads. Okay, so they would read the file and they would make notes on a case sheet, and they would assign an initial rating. Then it would go up to an associate director or senior associate director, and each associate director was responsible for maybe 10 to 15 of these second-year students. And the outcome of that would be, and this is an older system, but I'm going to talk about the system that I know, and then it's fairly standard across all the schools. Everybody has their own flavor, and then they would recommend interview or no interview. And then I had the job, of course, of then reviewing all those files and signing off on those case sheets. And what you're looking for there, sometimes what would happen is entrepreneurs would get overlooked, right? Accomplishments would get overlooked, or non-traditional students. Sometimes, I would walk over to my senior associate director who was responsible for that and say, hey, walk me through this. I think I'm seeing something here. And she might say, yes, this one didn't cross my desk. You're right. Let's interview this person and see what we wanted to do. And then at that time, we would then kind of separate out. We'd maybe interview around 50% of the candidates. The interview would happen. And then the interview sheet would go in the file. It would be reviewed by a different associate director. And then the files would come to me. I would do an initial sort. And if we were looking at admitting, say, 300 students in round one, I might cut the files down to 500. And then I created actually a new process whereby I would take all of those files into our conference room and have all the seniors, all the associate and senior associate directors come in, and we would work as a team for 2 or 3 days to bring the class down, to bring that round down to where we wanted to be. Yeah. So there's a lot in there of how you stand out in that process. And I'm guessing that's probably going to be your next question.
Yeah, you beat me to it. Well, actually, please keep that question in mind. But also, I'm curious in your system, right? Like when you had the second years rate the applications initially, was it like how that rating system worked? Was it like a 1 rating or 5 different ratings?
It was a 1 to 6. So 1 being amazing and 6 kind of being really just not ready for, not being ready for it. So,
yes. Okay. Yeah. So, and then the second question, how do you think applicants can stand out there?
Well, so I'd be curious to hear your experience as well, kind of how you did this. I think, to me, in a broader sense, right? So we're going to have a carve out for those students that maybe aren't as prepared, but aren't as prepared for a reason, right? So at that point, we had 3 rounds. And a lot of times in the third rounds, you would get non-traditional students, people from arts, entertainment, you get entrepreneurs, and people who are just not as well versed, right? If you take a McKinsey consultant, they know from day one, right? They're in a culture that kind of inculcates them into that MBA path. They have a lot of people around them who have MBAs, and so they get a lot of guidance. So I'm going to separate them out because they're a little bit different. But I think I think those students who have done the work up front, right? So those students who have really been thoughtful about who they are and why they want this, right? And so I would always ask people, look, these questions still hold true, right? Why do you want an MBA? Why is now the right time in your career? What are your short-term and long-term goals? And how will this particular school help you achieve them? And those are not trick questions. Those are questions that if you're going to invest $150,000, $180,000 into a building, right? You're going to pull the comps. You're going to look over all the permits. You're going to make sure everything's up to code. You're going to do all your due diligence, right? You're investing, if you look at lost opportunity cost and lost wages, this is a significant investment. You're probably up at around, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and 2 years of your life. And so we're asking students basically, have you done the work? Have you been thoughtful? And that to me is where the candidates stand out. And then also to me and to every reader we've ever had, authenticity of voice. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is a lot of times applicants think, oh, this is an essay writing contest, right? And you see this with the students you work with. I'm sure they're stressing over, does the comma go here? Does a word go here? What's the fanciest way that I can say that? And they forget that the people reading their applications you remember reading season, it's brutal, it's exhausting, right? You're just plowing through application after application after application. And the problem is that so many of them look the same, right? And from my experience, it's because the students haven't done the hard work. And I realize I sound like a typical Californian here. They haven't done the internal work to really know themselves and what they're trying to accomplish. Right? Because when they hit that, when they understand that, in my experience, their voice comes through very clearly. Right? Look, this is what I want to do. This is how I got here. And this is where I want to go. This is the gap. Now, your school specifically addresses that gap because of X, Y, and Z that you offer. Right. And as you've, I'm sure, drilled into your students and your listeners many, many times over, these schools might look the same at first blush, but they're very, very different. Your experience at a Harvard, a Stanford, a Wharton, any school is going to be it's different. There are different learning modalities, different ways that you're getting information, different ways that you are doing work and learning things. So it's very important to understand how that tracks to you. So I would, it's a lot of times you can over polish that essay so that when the reader reads it, it's just they're tired and it just kind of slips over their mind, right? It's just you're using the same words and the same phraseology, and the same lofty, aspirational language. And they're just like, really? Where you'd much rather have somebody who's just honest and self-aware, but well-researched and clear about their goals.
Wow, I love that. So what are some ways that you help your clients bring that authenticity of voice into their applications? Like, I mean, do you have any tactics there? Because I do think it's not like people aren't trying to be authentic. It's just that maybe they have an idea of what that should be, and then they end up sounding not authentic, or they're not used to showing sides of themselves in a proper school application, for example.
Right.
I'd love to hear any thoughts you have there in terms of how you coach people who ask you for help. Like, how can I make sure that I resonate, right? That it's my true voice coming through.
Right. And that's an excellent question. And again, to my point, for your listeners, we have very different expectations, right? So if you have, I know you're in Vietnam, for example, let's say you have somebody from the military, right, who's applying, or from the government, right? You're going to read their essays in a different light, right? Because you're going to say, okay, this person you look at the uniqueness of their path and what they've done, and you're not going to expect them to have the same clarity of voice and understanding as, again, somebody from the finance world. Right. I could be wrong, and certainly there's exceptions to every rule, but I think what I usually do is I try and start everybody from first principles and ask them those 5 important questions and drill them on the answers. Just really continue to drill down, right? Because nobody gets it right the first time, no matter what. And it's just really kind of talking with them and guiding them and pushing them and really getting them, because I think a lot of people worry about, how do I differentiate myself? And so they're looking for that sparkle factor. And in my experience, the sparkle factor, yes, are there students in the class that have done really exceptional, crazy things? Absolutely. And I'm sure you and I, over a coffee, could sit and tell stories about these really just wild applications we read where people, you're just like, wow, that is a story. But by and large, I think what I always try and get people to understand is that the bulk, the vast majority of those 8,000 or 3,000 or 10,000 applications that schools are getting are high-performing professionals. They're like you, right?
Yeah.
And their advantage is that they have created opportunity for themselves. They have pushed for that. Right. They have always kind of had a focus and a North Star, and they're getting good recommendations from seasoned professionals. Right. And we can, there's all the issues around recommendations, but the first thing is to really drill down until they can answer those questions in an authentic voice. Right. Stripped of what they think I want to hear, what they think the admissions committee wants to hear, because writing to the admissions committee is, in my experience, fatal. You don't know what they're looking for. And as we talked about earlier, they don't always know what they're looking for in that moment. And so if you try and guess what they want, you're trying to hit a very small, rapidly moving, changing target. And that's a recipe for disaster, right? So it's just repeating that and practicing it. And then the hard work of going in and understanding each school and how each school serves you best. Because I want applicants to be selfish, right? Yes, we see in the application how you can contribute to the school, but what I want to know is what do you want out of this? When you're in the class, when you're in the cohort, what are you trying to get? So that to me is, and then it's just a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and people really cursing my name until they get the results, right?
Yeah. And just to remind the audience, those 5 questions.
Of course.
Could you
why
just
do you want an MBA? Sure.
Number 1.
Why do you want an MBA? Number 2, why is now the right time in your career? Number 3, I guess these are two, right? What are your short-term and long-term goals? So that's 3 and 4. And number 5 is, how does this school help you achieve? How does our program help you achieve them?
Yes. Yes. I love that. That's so interesting. And when you bring up wanting applicants to be more selfish, I've always wanted to talk about this with someone. Now that you're here, I can. People get MBAs because generally they want to advance their careers. They want to increase their earning potential. They want to jump maybe into a different industry or function. They might feel stuck or plateaued and they want to climb. Is it as simple as saying something like that? Like, I want to make more money?
I think that's a great question. And my answer to that is that yes, but, right? And so it's fine to say, listen, I've kind of hit a point in my career where I realized I don't like this industry, right? Or so I want to change industries, or I want to make this next step. I've built a company and I want to move over to the venture side, or I've done industry and I've realized that I really want to go over to the consulting side. So perfectly normal, perfectly legitimate. You have candidates coming from the military who want to change and go into the private sector. You have a lot of people who say, I love what I do. I'm really good at what I do, but I want an MBA so that I can be really, really good at what I do. Right. So there's no wrong answer there, but I think it's the thoughtfulness of what you say. Right. It's like you started talking about alumni networks. Everybody comes up with that same old saw about how they want the network, the HBS network, the Wharton network, whatever network. And they forget the fact that a network is a living, breathing thing. Right. And a network, if I call someone from my class or a Wharton alum that I've interacted with, or somebody calls me, you're really putting it in the context of, okay, how do I know this person, right? And it may be fair, it may not be fair, but I still remember there was one of our very, very senior Japanese alumni talking about this. And he's like, look, for better or for worse, when somebody asks me for something, I think about them in social situations. I think about them in class. I think about them working on projects together.
Very interesting.
Right? Because
yeah, absolutely.
Because those are things that you see people's true character. And so I think as you grow together, as you grow this network together, I think it's really important, and this comes to knowing the program. It's not just saying, you can't just say, I really want the access to the network, because at the time that I was at Wharton, our alumni network was like 88,000 alumni. What does that mean? Well, it makes sense if you say, look, I live in Seoul, and in Seoul, there's a really strong alumni network in this particular area that I'm trying to get into. And so that's really going to help me. And it's something I can be active in and contribute to. Right. So, or, during school. So I think that, you differentiate yourself by really getting in there. And again, if you have tight, thoughtful answers to those questions, give you a personal example. So I was an entrepreneur, and I said, okay, like, we built this company and it was time I could finally step away from it. And I said, okay, I need to go learn this finance and accounting because I don't understand it the way that I should. So I looked for the school that terrified me. And at that time it was Wharton. And I liked the fact it had learning teams because I knew that I'd never survive first year finance, accounting, operations management on my own. And so that's a school that I wanted to go to for that particular reason. So I think, breaking it down for yourself.
Absolutely.
Right. Not just saying, oh, I want to study with Professor so-and-so because they teach so-and-so, and
exactly.
You pulled that off the website in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I love that. So just to kind of sum up what you're saying is make it personal and go a layer or two deeper on those things that most MBAs want. The increased salary, the increased network, right? Jumping into different industries. I have 2 kind of other subjects I'd like to talk to you with on the admissions front. One is the standardized tests. So GMAT, GREs now.
Sure.
How did you guys look at scores that were close to the average, way above the average, way below the average? And when would scores just at a certain level just knock people out of the running because they were so low, even if they were super exceptional in other ways? Like, how did you guys kind of think about the GMAT?
Sure, and that's a great question, and certainly now it's even more complex because you have some schools that went test optional for a while. You have the GRE, you have the GMAT, and I sat on one of the boards of the GMAT of the. So you know, I'd be happy to talk about this for a few minutes. I think that the GMAT and your listeners now are again going to bang their heads against the wall because they're like, oh my God, his answer to everything is it depends, right? GMAT obviously is dependent on the student. And one of the hardest things we had to do every year, and this is a surprise for most people, was make sure our average GMAT score didn't go too high, right? Why is that? It's because when you want diversity in a class, right? If you go back to that statistic I mentioned, you know, we had about half the applicants had GMAT scores higher than 750. You know, it's crazy. So if I wanted to build a class where the average GMAT score was 770, I could do that very easily, right? But what does that do? That takes your non-traditional, your more diverse, interesting students who are maybe not as good on a standardized test, right? And for a variety of reasons, maybe it's a language issue, maybe it's a background issue, maybe it's a cultural issue, and that's a whole other podcast that we could talk about. But it scares them away because even though on all of our statistics sheets and on the slide that I would put up these presentations, it would say average GMAT, I'd always kind of joke with the room because I'd say, look, who here is good at math? Everybody raise their hands. Okay. Who here knows that our minimum GMAT is whatever our average was that year, like 710? And a lot of them would raise their hand. I'd say, guys, what does an average mean? An average means their scores higher, their scores lower. So I have students in the class that have 800 GMATs, but I've admitted students with 650 GMATs, right? My goal, the admissions goal, when you're looking at the GMAT score, is you're looking at it to just reinforce something, right? Especially a school like Wharton that was that had a rigorous quantitative discipline, right? We had a responsibility to not admit people who would not be successful.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the bottom end. Right. Yeah.
The bottom end. I mean, can you imagine taking somebody out of their career, layering on the debt when you just know they're not going to survive? And that's irresponsible of us and just violating our duty to the school and to the student. And so what we really want to do is look at it and say, okay, look, if this person went to Princeton and got really good grades and got an A in calculus, and we feel like they can handle the work, and they didn't do the best, and then they went out to San Francisco and worked in the nonprofit sphere, and they didn't do the best on the GMAT. Okay, if they've done really interesting things and excelled in other areas of their life, we might say, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to admit them. We're going to have them take some math classes over the summer to make sure that they're ready. But we know that they can handle it, right? The same token, if you look at somebody who went to, I don't know, MIT or Carnegie Mellon and did undergraduate in computer science and got all A's, and they come to you with a 660 GMAT, that's usually an indicator, not always, but it's an indicator sometimes of laziness, right? They took it once, they got a 660, they're like, meh, it's fine, right? So I think it says different things about different candidates, and you need to think about where the standardized test fits into your overall profile. If you're applying to highly quantitative schools, taking the GRE, for example, might indicate that you're hiding from the quantitative side, right? Because it's quantitatively less rigorous than the GMAT. So I would say look at both tests and see what you need to communicate, right? If you're communicating to a school that is softer on the quantitative, then maybe the GRE is going to work really well for you. But if you're trying to go to MIT or Wharton or Chicago, you have to show that you can survive the fire of that quantitative rigor.
I love that how you phrase it as, what are you saying? What are you trying to communicate? Because oftentimes it's easy to just get wrapped up with like a score and a percentage. But as you've said so well, like, what is the context of your situation? What is the school you're applying to, and what are you trying to communicate with your test scores? Right.
I
love that. And often, and if the admissions office reaches out to you and says, well, can you do this little extra work here or retake the exam, and you're not willing to do that, what is that communicating as well?
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
So I think that's, I think that's good on the GMAT. Now, the other question I had was your advice for internationals, because I know you've done a lot of work with international students, and standing out at a place like Wharton or another top business school where you make up a smaller percentage, right, of the overall class. And just if you kind of have some tips for standing out for this pool of applicants.
Of course. And I think, so I think one thing that I would say is there can be in certain international applicant pools, and again, this is going to be a broad generalization, but there can be groupthink. All right. And there's in some countries, very strong cultures around going to top MBA programs, and everybody's sharing information and talking. And I think it inhibits people from being themselves in the application process. And so you get very, I'm not sure if it's that people are using the same essay reviewers or the same consultants or, working together in groups, but you get, and I won't speak for you, I can see definite similarities from different regions and countries in the way they're doing and extracurricular activities that students are doing. So I think number one, being able to, first of all, and I know it's hard sometimes. And if you look at, I'll use two very specific examples, for example, like Japan and South Korea, right? So if you're a company person in Japan or you work for LG in South Korea, right? Like, how do you stand out? There's a very prescribed career path there. You're not getting extra projects. You're not, right? You have far less opportunity to not distinguish yourself, but far less opportunity to kind of color outside the lines, for lack of a better term. So in that case, it's very important for you, to be a top performer at work, but then also find something you can do where you can add value kind of in different areas of the company, right? Or outside of work, right? And bringing your personality to bear and something genuine, something that really is unique, right? So if you're working for a company and you're an international and you have a chance to travel, or maybe you're building like a restaurant resource for other people who are traveling, so they know, when you go to this city, like, here's some great places to go to eat because you really love food, you love cooking, whatever that is. I think you have to use testing to your advantage, right? So especially, I think a lot of people don't realize the strategy of putting together an application and how it's reviewed. And so, as you said, they look at the GMAT as a standalone score, and they look at their transcript as a standalone thing. And then they look at their essays as a standalone part, but they're all interconnected, right? And so if you are an American student who went to Yale and majored in comparative literature and you didn't do that great on the verbal part of the GMAT, I'm not concerned, right? But if you're coming from overseas, I am going to pay attention, as our admissions officer is going to pay attention, because they want to make sure, hey, are you going to be able to contribute to the class dynamic, right? Which I think is a very fair assessment. So I think all of those things, you have to make sure that your strategy works. You have to make sure that you have a coherent answer to those 5 questions, right? I think you need an awareness of the school's alumni network in your country, your path.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Why are you doing this? If you have the opportunity, have you consulted with other alumni, right? Do you have a sense of what it's like? And so conveying that authentically in essays is very important.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's
it's frustrating. It's frustrating. Your clients, your listeners all want, this magic bullet. And as you said, this algorithm or formula. but there's really not. It's really hard when you're making those fine distinctions. It's just that person that kind of pushes themselves a little bit more, finds or creates that interesting opportunity, and then is able to convey it effectively.
Yeah. No, exactly. Exactly. And so some ways we try to help, I mean, just to share, like applicants do exactly what you just said, is we score applicants on a 15-point scale. And I know this is already this is already in the range of like, oh, like really? But I think the exercise of showing them how we score them and why hopefully gives them some insight into, oh, I never thought about like that admissions might look at this side of me. So maybe I need to tune up this part of my application. For example, showing that I have international work experience, just to list one example, or that showing my leadership qualities outside of work, something like that. So I'm hoping this rubric kind of spurs them to think more. I mean, I won't say the word H word, but to think more broadly about how they can differentiate themselves and answer those 5 questions in a more authentic but yet powerful way. Yeah. So that's kind of how we've tried to sort of help them in that sense. But okay, Thomas, I have 2 more questions. I hope you still have time.
Sure. Yes. No, absolutely.
So can we talk about how you would advise MBA applicants to think about the MBA as an investment, and how you think they can improve their chances to lower the cost of the MBA?
No, fair enough. And I think, this question, and I'm fairly ruthless about this. Just, I view this as a business decision, right? And so I think, and I spoke about this briefly before, right? You're foregoing salary, potential promotions, opportunities, and you're paying a lot of money for this, right? And I always suggest that applicants look at this and say, okay, what if I get no scholarship, right? What if I get no scholarship? What does this look like? Because then to me, getting a scholarship is icing on the cake, right? But I think you need to make it clear-eyed, and you need to look at it and you say, okay,
yeah,
right? So you look at it and you say, okay, here's my cost of going, and what am I trying to accomplish? And that's why, when you say, a student will come to you and say, okay, I want to make more money. That to me is a very kind of nebulous reason for doing an MBA. Right? What do you mean by make more money? What are you hoping to accomplish? Do you need an MBA to go there? I would get students who would say, well, I'm going to go into sales and trading because you can make a lot of money in sales and trading. It's okay. Well, have you been on a sales and trading floor? Because they hire really smart people who make money. They don't care if you have an MBA. They don't care if you didn't graduate from high school. Really, if you can sit in front of a bank of monitors and make money, you're good, right? For other professions, absolutely. If you want to be a senior partner in a top consulting or banking firm, you absolutely need an MBA, right? You need, in most cases, not absolutely, but in most cases, you need the MBA. So I think, first of all, it's understanding your path. If you're looking to go, for example, into government service or nonprofit, look at schools that have aggressive loan or generous loan forgiveness programs, because a lot of schools do have that, right? So for non-traditional students, where are schools that are going to provide the most opportunity for you to get your loans forgiven, right? For entrepreneurs, for example, look at not just business plan competitions and entrepreneurship centers and resources, but look at, in a lot of the schools, if you really dig into their websites, they will have grants. Not, they're not taking equity either, but they'll actually give you grants. They'll give you office space to work in. So these are really important things that I think a lot of students don't think about because they're so focused on like, well, how much money am I going to get to this, right? Then obviously, once you're admitted, you may or may not get a financial aid award. And it never hurts to go back and ask. Now, are you in a better position if you have 3 offers in hand, 2 of which have high financial aid awards? Absolutely. Will the third school sometimes come back and say, yeah, well, congratulations, right? Those other schools really value you. We just don't have the money for you. And so you need to make a choice. And then in that case, I think students can get very caught up in things that don't matter sometimes, like perceived brand value.
Okay.
Right.
Tell me more. Yeah.
Well, I think sometimes students will come to me and they'll say, okay, I got a full ride at this school. I got a full ride at USC. Okay. And I got into Chicago and I got no money. Right. Or I got a $5,000 award. What should I do? Chicago's much higher ranked than USC. No disrespect to USC. And I'll say, okay, well, what do you want to do? What do you want to do after you graduate? And they'll say, well, for example, I really want to work in real estate in California, right? Say, okay, well, that to me is a no-brainer because the USC mafia in Los Angeles and San Diego, right? I mean, it's rock solid.
Yeah.
And or if you want, if you want to be, so that is a no-brainer. Or if the choice is between USC full ride and even Chicago or Stern, where you're paying your way, right? And you want to be an entrepreneur, then you have to say to them, okay, well, USC is a really good school and you're already now starting $300,000 ahead than you would if you went to these other schools. So you're going to capture an additional $300,000 worth of value by attending that other school. And I think you need to be really ruthless about that. Likewise, there are schools out there, the cost difference between Harvard, right, and the number 100th ranked MBA program is not that much, right? But there's a very, very different return on investment. And so I think you need to be very clear-eyed around. Students get so caught up sometimes in, I have to go get an MBA, that they can put themselves really in a bad financial position. And I think that you really need to be able to step back and say, okay, am I really getting value for this investment? And if you're not, then maybe thinking about alternate ways, and especially now post-pandemic, where there's so many online options and so many ways you can get certifications and things that you can get from a top university, a certificate of financial analysis that can help your career without incurring that kind of debt and being 2 years out of the workforce. So I think directly answer your question, maybe, but I think of financial aid there are so many different pieces in that puzzle.
Yeah. No, I think it's such good advice. And I think the challenge with that is usually you haven't gone down the path that you're evaluating. So sometimes it's hard, if they're lucky to talk to you, you can walk the student through or the applicant through that thought process, but maybe they don't know anyone who has gotten a certificate in financial analysis and seeing how much impact that can have. So, I mean, I think it's kind of an obvious answer, but try to talk to people that have gone through it. And I feel like that's the best way to kind of peek around the corner, at least having a better idea of what life will be like around the corner. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know. Do you have another, do you see what I'm saying? Is there something else you'd recommend?
It's hard, right? Because I think you bring up a very good point in that they don't know what they don't know, right? But to me, this all gets down to that first question I asked is, why do you want an MBA? And the second question, why is now the right time in your career? And it's really about thinking through that whole life cycle and doing the research, being diligent, getting on the internet, joining chat groups, reaching out to alumni from your school, and just meeting as many people as you can to get that awareness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thomas, this has been a great chat. I have one last question for you. It's more of a personal question, given that you're going to be, you're 20 years out from Wharton.
Yes.
And it's interesting because with that distance, you can kind of see how the MBA has impacted your career, what elements of it have really helped you, what you've really taken from those 2 years. And I'm just wondering, if you have any last thoughts for our listeners in terms of what you wish more applicants would consider when they're thinking about getting their MBA, now that you're 20 years out from it.
I think that, and I understand this, right? A lot of applicants, and I think you see that, they view the MBA as the brass ring, right? I get my MBA and I'm totally set. And it is a step on your journey. It is what you make of it. So you certainly could go to the top MBA program in the world and do nothing with it, right? You can go to the top MBA program in the world and meet people and be involved and get to know your professors and learn as much as you can and arrive every day with confidence, but humility, right? And that will build friendships and relationships and knowledge that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. So my 2 years at Wharton had fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life. It made me a better entrepreneur. It made me a better student. It made me a better human being, right? And I think that opportunity is something that you should really just go in and make the most of, and don't expect a quick payoff. Yes, you'll probably get a bump in salary, a bump in position. You might join a great company, but then you again have to earn, right? You have to earn your path, earn the respect, earn your success. But the MBA can help you at every step of that. So I think it's a wonderful thing. It's not the right thing for everybody. And I just encourage people to don't get too caught up in the chase and really be honest about, is this the best thing for me? And then if it is, do the hard work. And I love your approach, having listened to past episodes and read your website and things that you've written. I think you take a great approach to building people and having people really do the work and the self-reflection. So I think those are all meaningful. That's the hard work that a lot of people don't necessarily always want to do, but pays tremendous dividends.
Oh man. Normally I would end the podcast on that great answer, but I have one more question. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I can't help myself. I can't help myself.
No, I love it. I love it.
I've kept Thomas longer than I told him I would, guys. As an entrepreneur who, before your MBA and now after your MBA, this is a huge question. Can an MBA really help you? You said, it helped you become a better entrepreneur, but it's a huge investment. So what advice would you have for aspiring entrepreneurs thinking about MBAs, especially in today's environment where, like you said, there's so many other options? Yes. Would you go back to what you told me before? I'm just curious. Yeah. Like your thoughts there.
So I think that entrepreneurs in particular can get tremendous value out of an MBA. Right. Do you need an MBA to be a successful entrepreneur? Absolutely not. Right. Absolutely not. But I think that being an entrepreneur helps you in many ways. It helps you understand HR. It helps you understand how to write an effective business plan. It helps you understand the venture capital and private equity communities, right? Because there's a big difference as an entrepreneur between building a business and building a business that is attractive to investors. You build the business differently. You need to know how to talk to them. You need to know, what does a term sheet mean? You need to know how to build and manage a team, right? Because if successful entrepreneurs understand, and like good executives, good leaders, you want to surround yourself with people that are smarter than you and then manage that process around your idea, right? And so I think that in addition to access to professors and entrepreneurship centers and all the other things, real world examples. I had a classmate, for example, and I just saw him at our reunion, who showed up day one to our cohort and said, listen, I'm an entrepreneur. I've started 3 companies. I'm starting a new company, and I'm going, every class that I'm in, I'm going to take that learning and focus it in on this new company that I'm building. And he did. And the cool thing, and I did this with an acquisition I was trying to do as well, is especially when you're a startup entrepreneur, you don't have money to go hire Baker McKenzie and McKinsey and JP Morgan and all these like top tier white shoe firms to help you. But your classmates and your friends are all coming from those firms. So you have the opportunity to sit down with people from the top consulting companies of the world and say, listen, how do I frame this market? How do I think about this? Am I considering this correctly? And getting their very different viewpoint, right? Having investment bankers or venture professionals help you figure out how to structure this deal or how to raise money or how to structure debt financing or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So in the moment, in those 2 years as an entrepreneur, I think it's immensely valuable. And then as you go through your career, right, trying to get into a new market, trying to raise money, trying to acquire a company, trying to think about a shift in strategy, you have access to people who sometimes now are at the top of their industry, right? Literally the top of their industry. And they're taking your call on a friend basis and giving you informal advice, right? Or if you're successful, sometimes you're able to retain them. So I think that's really important. And I think too, I would say the same thing to non-traditional. I remember speaking to a group of nonprofit people from the nonprofit sector. Were at Penn, and they invited me to come talk to them. And they were trying to boo me off the stage, right? Because I was the big, bad, evil MBA person. And I said, look, you all are trying to do great things, right? How do you do great things? You hire exceptional people, you manage them towards a goal, you raise money, you get a board that helps you influence things to make the changes that you want. All of these things you learn in an MBA program, right? Do you need, again, you don't need the MBA, but these are things that are core to entrepreneurship, to the nonprofit sector, to corporate America, or the corporate world. So I think, yes, as an entrepreneur, I found the MBA experience to be tremendously valuable. If you look at, one great example, when I was director of admissions, the Warby Parker founders were Wharton students. And I remember them coming to me before their business plan competition where they really broke big. And they're like, hey, can we talk to you about this? Because we know you've done some entrepreneurship stuff.
Wow.
And so it was, amazing success story. So anyway, again, apologies, overly long answer to a very short question. So.
Oh, thank you so much, Thomas, for coming on the show, sharing frankly and transparently your insights and your experience. I think this episode will be really well received. Where can our audience, if they want to learn more about your work or potentially work with you, where can they find you?
Appreciate that, Darren. They can come to thomascaleel.com or listen to the Admittedly podcast, available everywhere, and would welcome them to do that. It's so nice meeting somebody who not only understands, who's been in a director role, right? Because I think, as I said before, we have a very different perspective on admissions, and somebody who takes, I think, a very thoughtful and holistic approach to guiding and growing students. So I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Very cool. So we'll link to Thomas's site in the show notes. And thanks again, Thomas. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Darren. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Touch MBA podcast. Remember, you can get free school selection help and a profile review at touchmba.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Just search for Touch MBA.